Very well. So now I'm going to give you a brief overview of clinical trials in MSA in general, and just to give you two examples of clinical trials that are now actively enrolling at our site, at our center at NYU. And, well, I'll give you more details. So what is a clinical trial? Lucy mentioned before the natural history study. That's not a clinical trial. A clinical trial is a research study involving human patients, to determine the effects of a drug or a device on humans' health, right? So there needs to be an intervention, something that the patient is given, something that the patient is administered that usually the patient wouldn't get unless he or she is enrolled in a clinical trial, right? So the natural history study is not a clinical trial. We are just following patients every year and trying to understand the disease, right? So for instance, it's a research study, meaning if a doctor is giving a treatment to a patient, a treatment that is already approved, that's not a clinical trial. It has to be in humans, so clinical trials are never done in animals, right? And it's an intervention on the human health. And this can be either a clinical trial to see if we can stop the progression of the disease, or a clinical trial to test new drugs to improve symptoms in patients, right? So this is a question for you guys, so raise your hands. Which one of these is a clinical trial? So raise your hand if you think this is a clinical trial. Right? So a doctor prescribing iron to treat anemia in a patient. Is this a clinical trial? No. Good. Study to test if aspirin can prevent cancer in rats. Is it a clinical trial? No, because it's in rats, right? A company selling stem cells for the treatment of neurological disorders in patients. Is this a clinical trial? No, right. It's not a clinical trial because the company is already assuming that the stem cell is doing something and it's selling it to patients. This is not a research study, right? This is a quack company, by the way. A study to define kidneys abnormalities in Parkinson's disease. Is this a clinical trial? No, because it's just studying an organ. It's not administering any treatment or any device to the patient, right? So none of this is a clinical trial. Good job, guys. So why do we need clinical trials? What's the buzz with the clinical trials? Well, we need to prove that a drug is effective to improve health in clinical trials, because this is the only way the Food and Drug Administration will approve the drug, okay? The Food and Drug Administration, I'm assuming you guys know, is the agency of the government that deals with new drugs, approvals, safety. So you need to have FDA blessing to sell a drug, right, for a specific indication. And that implies that the insurance company will pay for that. If a drug is not FDA approved for some indication, the insurance company is not going to pay for that, and you will have to pay out of pocket, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec when we talk about one of the clinical trials we are doing. How many of you did receive this message or remember receiving this message through social media, right? Bioheavens receives orphan drug designation from FDA from MSA. Raise your hands, whoever read these, right? Okay, a few of you, right? So this was in February, right? So Biohaven receives orphan drug designation from FDA for MSA. It doesn't say approved. Okay, it just says orphan drug designation, whatever that means. Another example, who got this? Prana receives orphan drug designation for treatment of MSA by the FDA, a few of you as well, right? So this was in January, the other was in February. What does this mean? I mean, some of you emailed me, I got 25 calls from patients that day. Dr. Palma, what does this mean? Is this going on? What's going on? Did the FDA approve this? No. This is not FDA approved. This means nothing at all. I mean, this is just a strategy from the companies to raise awareness that they are working in MSA, and that it want to raise awareness among investors, and they just want to tell the FDA, look, we are having a promising molecule here. We just need your a little pat on the back, and the FDA says, sure, I mean, it looks great, but they still need to do clinical trials. They still need to prove it's safe, and they still need to prove it's effective, right? And so far, this hasn't happened, right? So these two molecules, they haven't even started clinical trials yet, right? So I know this can be confusing information sometimes, but I'm trying you to be aware that the key word here is FDA approved, right? And this is not FDA approved. This is just orphan drug designation, breakthrough designation, high interest drug. Okay, it's interesting, it's good news. It means a company is working on something for MSA. That's great news, but that doesn't mean the drug is approved, right? So, very brief overview of a clinical trials structure or strategy, right? So first of all, you usually do tests in animals, right? This is called preclinical research or basic research. You just do a number of studies to see if the molecule has some promise in treating the disease, right? For MSA, you can use little mice with MSA-like problems, right? And there are ways to create a mouse that looks a lot like MSA, right? It's not exactly the same, but looks pretty much like it. And there are genetic ways and a number of other methods. So that's the first step, is make sure that the mice have a good response. And then if there is promising data in animals, you go to humans, right? And humans is what we call, again, clinical trials. And then you have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials are very small trials, maybe 5, 10 patients in MSA. It's just to make sure that the patients don't die, basically, right? That you give that molecule to a patient, and that the patient sort of doesn't get a significant side effect or any other severe reaction, right? It's not to see if the drug is effective, right? It's just to see what is the initial reaction of that drug in patients. Then you have phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. Very similar. The only difference is the number of patients, right? In phase 2 trials of MSA, you usually enroll around 50 patients. And this phase 2 is to see if there is a signal in terms of efficacy, right? You want to gather preliminary data to see if the drug is doing something. And then if there is a signal in phase 2, you usually do phase 3, which is the same, but more people, right? Now the phase 3 shows that there is good data, that the drug is safe, that the drug is effective. The information is submitted to the FDA, and then the FDA approves the drug, right? And when that happens, doctors can prescribe it, nurse practitioners can prescribe it too, and the insurance will pay. Again, if the FDA has not approved a drug for a specific indication, the insurance won't pay for it. Now, as I mentioned before, we can have two group of trials, particularly for MSA. One is trials to develop new drugs or to test new drugs to improve quality of life and symptoms, right? Basically symptoms. So you can have drugs you can have trials for new drugs for blood pressure problems, for neurogenic orthostatic hypotension. You can have a clinical trial to test a new drug for bladder problems. You can have a trial to test a new drug for constipation, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is to make life easier, and these are usually shorter trials, right? Maybe the trial duration is around a month or a few months or a few weeks, right? Because you just need to see if there is any change in blood pressure or in symptoms related to blood pressure, or there is any change in constipation, so that you don't need too many weeks to see that, right? Then the other type of trial is to see if we can stop the progression of the disease, or at least slow the progression of the disease. And this is what we call a potential disease-modifying therapy. When you hear disease-modifying, it means a cure or at least something to slow the progression of the disease, right? These trials are different from the other ones. First of all, they are usually longer. You need at least 1 year to see if there is any signal in these trials. And then symptoms may or may not get better. It may even get worse. How come? Well, think of this as a cancer treatment, right? So you have people with cancer, they take the chemotherapy or the pills to stop the cancer, to kill the cancer, right? But on the other hand, that medication can make their life miserable for a while, right? They can the hair falls off, they can get nauseous, they can get diarrhea, but I mean, the objective is not to make their life better, it's just to stop the disease, right? Or to destroy the disease. So this in MSA eventually could be the same, right? You have a potential drug that may stop the progression of the disease or slow the progression of the disease, but maybe you may have to pay some price in terms of potential side effects, right? And again, it's the same as cancer. Some people think, okay, doc, I want to have that drug. I know it's going to make my life miserable for a while, but if it's going to kill the cancer, I'll take it. And some of the patients with cancer say, doc, I don't want my hair going down. I don't want my quality of life be destroyed. So I'd rather not take this medication. And it's a conversation that patients need to have with the doctors. But again, the main point is that these drugs may not make you feel better, right? And that's important. Okay, which of these is FDA approved to slow the progression of MSA? Raise your hands. Stem cells, hyperbaric oxygen, medical marijuana, nilotinib, coenzyme Q10, or IVIGs? None of them, exactly. So I know some of you got these, right? Because I know you, and I know some of you got some of these, or all, or well, not all, but some of these. None of these has been proven to slow the progression of the disease. None of these will be paid by the FDA, and in some of them, it's a problem, right? Because stem cells, unless they are within a clinical trial, they are going to charge you thousands of dollars, and it's not going to do anything. So beware of people telling you that they have a fantastic stem cell treatment and then it's going to cure your disease. That's not true. That's not true. Otherwise, I will be using that treatment, right? So none of these approaches has any safety or efficacy proven for MSA, not FDA approved, and the insurance will not pay for that. You will have to pay for them. Sometimes it's a lot of money. And again, none of these has been proven to be useful for MSA. Now, of course, you may think, okay, so the only option I have to access some potential useful drug is to participate in a clinical trial, right? Yes, right now that's the only option. So, but participating in clinical trials has pros and cons, right? The main pros is the one I just mentioned, right? Patients have the possibility of getting new, perhaps potentially useful treatments for free. Clinical trials are always free, okay? That's another interesting point, right? You should never pay anything in a clinical trial. If you have to pay something in a clinical trial, there's some fishy, shady business there, right? Another pro is that clinical trials are usually performed by big academic medical centers, and these doctors doing the clinical trials have a lot of expertise in this disease, right? So you are usually evaluated by a good team, an expert team, which in addition to treating you for the clinical trial may give you potential pieces of advice that other doctors may not give you. And then, of course, you are contributing to the MSA science, and you are at the forefront of potential discoveries. It has potential cons, too. I mean, most of the clinical trials, high-quality clinical trials, have placebo, right? Have the possibility of patients getting placebo. Sometimes the possibility is 50%, sometimes the possibility is less, sometimes it may be more. But this is something that good clinical trials, well-designed clinical trials require, and the FDA requires placebo in clinical trials. So that's, if you are not comfortable with the possibility of getting a placebo, meaning a sugar pill that is not going to do anything, maybe a clinical trial is not for you, right? Some of the patients are okay and take the chances, right? You may get the active drug, but the active drug may have severe side effects, or in the worst of cases, may be completely useless. That's a possibility, because that's why we are doing a clinical trial. We want to do a clinical trial to see if a drug is effective, right? It may not be effective. If it were effective, we will be using it already, right? And then trials require time, effort, commitment on the side of patients and families, right? And sometimes for months or for years, right? So again, some people are very excited about clinical trials, are willing to take the chances and are willing to commit. Some of the patients don't, and that's fine. I mean, that's okay. Not clinical trials are not for everyone. And then remember, this may sound a little cold-hearted, but when you participate in a clinical trial, you are a guinea pig, right? You are a guinea pig, right? I mean, that doesn't need to be bad per se, but you are a guinea pig, and it's a research project, right? It's a research project that you are being taken part of. It's not clinical care, so it's slightly different. Again, some patients are perfectly comfortable with this, some of the patients are not, and that's perfectly fine. So as one take-home, the major take-home message from this talk is, okay, doc, how can I find legit clinical trials for MSA? You go to this website, okay? It's clinicaltrials.gov. So you go to this website, clinicaltrials.gov, and here, condition or disease, you just type whatever, right? Multiple system atrophy, boom. And it's gonna show you all the past clinical trials, all the present clinical trials, the current clinical trials, and some of the clinical trials that are going to start imminently in the forthcoming weeks, right? If a clinical trial does not appear here, beware, don't trust, okay? Any legit clinical trial will be here. Let me tell you something else. Not every study here in this website, despite of the name of the website, not every study here is a clinical trial. For instance, our natural history study appears here too, but that's not a clinical trial, right? So go over, see the information, see what you think, and then you can select the geographical area, right? Because this is worldwide. You're gonna get, if you search for clinical trials in MSA, you're gonna get 2 or 3 trials that are being done right now in South Korea. I mean, if you wanna go to South Korea, that's okay. So for instance, let's go to condition or disease, multiple system atrophy, and it would pop up, right? Country, let's do United States, just for the sake of. So you do search, and it says, oh, 54 studies for MSA. That's great. So, but of course, some of them, for instance, this one, multiple system atrophy, multidisciplinary clinic. This is in UT Southwestern Medical Center. That doesn't sound like a clinical trial. It's probably that they have their own study to follow patients, right? And if you keep clicking, it says there should be a summary here. This is a prospective core study to examine the disease burden of multiple system atrophy and the impact of multidisciplinary care on quality of life and caregiver burden. So this is not a clinical trial. This is just they want to follow patients with MSA, which is very interesting, but that's not a clinical trial. Okay, the second one. The second one, look at that. A futility trial of sirolimus in MSA at NYU. Wow, that sounds like a good trial, a legit trial. So this is a single center, randomized, placebo-controlled, phase 2, futility clinical trial. Okay, this is a clinical trial, right? It tells you here. So let me show you, because here you'll have all the information that you need to make a decision on that clinical trial, right? So, okay, these people need to enroll 55 participants, so it's not a lot, but it's like a phase 2. The study started in September. It's gonna finish in August 2021. Okay, and then we have what they are measuring, the outcome measures, and then the eligibility criteria, which is interesting, right? So what are they looking for? Okay, we need participants aged this that have MSA, who are less than 4 years from the time of documented MSA diagnosis, who are still able to walk with or without assistance. So walker is okay, a cane is okay. What we don't want is people who are completely wheelchair bound, et cetera, right? And then at the end, usually we'll tell you the contact so who's the principal investigator is Dr. Palma, right? And then it will tell you how to get in touch with these people, right? Where is this? Here, right? So if you are more interested, you just click here and send an email to Mr. Martinez or whatever. So, what? You tell me. What does it say here? Recruiting, right? It says, this website says everything, right? So for instance, this one, treatment of MSA using IVIGs. It was completed and has results, means it's not open, it's not recruiting. Here, treatment of Parkinson's disease and MSA using intranasal insulin, again, completed, right? Here, norepinephrine transporter blockade for autonomic failure. Look at that, NYU. So it's, you get the gist of it, right? So, but again, if a study doesn't appear here, beware of that study, right? I just did a brief summary of one of our trials that I wanted to show you. I'll go back to that trial and answer questions. Let me show you another example of another trial we are doing, which is to treat symptoms, right? So we are doing right now one trial for neurogenic orthostatic hypotension, meaning blood pressure problems in patients with MSA. And we are not enrolling patients with MSA only, we are also enrolling patients with Parkinson's and with pure autonomic failure, because these other patients also have neurogenic orthostatic hypotension. So in trials that test new approaches for symptoms, this is not infrequent, meaning, okay, if I'm trying a new drug for constipation, it doesn't need to be specifically constipation in MSA. It can be constipation in MSA and other related disorders, right? So this is what's happening in this trial. So this is a new, completely investigational drug, and is a phase 3 study, and is sponsored by Theravance, which is a pharmaceutical company. And then we have the other example of study is the one I just showed you in clinicaltrials.org, right? So we want to test if this drug, if this sirolimus, is effective to slow the progression of MSA. This is an FDA-approved drug to treat organ transplant rejection, right? So this drug is already FDA approved for that indication. Dr. Palma, can you just write a prescription for this drug? I could, but but your insurance is not going to pay for it, right? And this is a pretty expensive medication. That's why we need to show whether this drug is useful for MSA or not, because once we show that to the FDA, hopefully they will start the process of approval, and if approved, eventually that will get paid by the insurance company. Again, all these if the drug works. If it doesn't work, forget about it, right? This is not a pharmaceutical company. This is NIH and NYU, right? So this is the National Institutes of Health giving us the money, giving us the support, giving us the expertise in association with ourselves, right? Let me talk a little bit more, just 2 slides of the first trial, the Theravance trial. This is the one for NOH. This is active, open, and enrolling. Why is there a need for another drug for NOH? Well, as I mentioned before, right now we have a number of drugs approved for the treatment of NOH. We have midodrine, we have fludrocortisone, and we have Northera. In most patients, in some patients, they are very effective. Some patients get a very good response from any of those. But there is around 20-30% of patients with NOH who do not respond well to any treatment now available. So there's still need for other approaches. And this drug that we are testing from this company, this called TD9855 or ampreloxetine, has a completely different mechanism of action from midodrine, from Northera, and from fludrocortisone. So it's going to be interesting to see if patients respond to these as well as to the other ones, right? So, and there is encouraging data because this drug already completed a phase 2 study, small study. There was some promising data, and now they are doing the phase 3 study, which is like a lot of patients, right? It's like around 200 patients. The drug is taken once a day. It's just the trial lasts only for a month. You get a 50% chance of getting placebo, and what we are measuring is symptoms of orthostatic hypotension and blood pressure. You, of course, never have to pay to be enrolled, and patients get some economic reimbursement for their time and travel and expenses, right? So who's a good candidate for this trial? Well, it's a patient who has blood pressure problems, who has neurogenic orthostatic hypotension, and who is not very satisfied with the current treatment. So maybe this is a good trial for that patient, right? Again, NOH caused by MSA. We are also enrolling Parkinson's and PAF who have moderate symptoms of dizziness, lightheadedness when standing up with the blood pressure drops. And if you have renal failure, if you have advanced dementia, you may not be a good candidate. And of course, because we are testing this drug for a month, patient needs to stop other medications during that month, right? And that may be challenging for some patients, but some others are willing to try. And so if you think this might be a good trial for you, just contact Jose Martinez or let me know right now at the end of the talk, and I can give you more information, right? The other trial, the one I mentioned before in the clinicaltrials.org, is this drug we are trying to stop the progression of the disease, right? To I don't like to say that word cure, because we are not, I mean, reasonably, we are not curing everything. What we will be doing is at least stopping or making the disease much slower. That's our hope, right? So this is a drug that it's already approved by the FDA for other reasons, right? So it's been around for a while. It's been around for like 20 years. And the interesting thing about this drug is that it activates a mechanism called autophagy. What is the autophagy? It's a process by which the organism eliminates excessively accumulated proteins. And if you remember from Dr. Norcliffe's talk at the beginning, there is this protein called alpha-synuclein, which we believe is the cause of the problems in MSA. So there is excessive accumulation of alpha-synuclein. This in turn kills neurons, and the killing of the neurons causes all the problems that patients with MSA have, right? So what we know from other studies, from other research projects, is that this drug, this sirolimus, activates the process by which proteins like alpha-synuclein are eliminated. So, okay, that sounds great to treat this excessive alpha-synuclein, right? Because particularly MSA is caused by this, right? And this is a summary, but basically it's the same. Well, we know that alpha-synuclein creates these clumps of garbage in the neurons and in the brain, and this garbage eventually kills the neurons and the brain, right? So if there was a way to stop this, it would be great. Now we have another piece of useful information, which is when this drug was given to rats, when these sirolimus were given to mice with MSA, the disease appeared to slow and sometimes stop, right? So the drug stopped neurodegeneration, improved movement, and prevented aging, right? Again, this is in rats. In animals, everything looks great in animals, and then when you do the clinical trials, it's a little bit different. But nevertheless, it's a very encouraging information, and we said, okay, let's test it in humans, right? This is a nice representation of what I told you before, right? So these are the clumps of alpha-synuclein in the neurons, and what we are trying is just to activate the elimination, to activate the digestion and the expulsion, the expelling of these alpha-synuclein from the neurons, right? And hopefully the sirolimus can do that, right? So good and promising data. Sirolimus, interestingly, has never been tested in patients with neurodegeneration, right? So no one has ever done this in Parkinson's. No one has ever done this in Alzheimer's. So we are doing this for the first one in any neurodegenerative disease for the first time, right? And that's why we started this new clinical trial. So where is this being done? It's only at NYU. It's only us. You won't find this anywhere else, right? It's a relatively small study, and it's just us. We need 56 people. We already recruited 25, so we still need the other half. So this is oral capsules, not tablets. It's capsules. It's once a day, and it's supposed to be taken for a year, right? Could you get placebo? Yes. You have 1 chance out of 4 of getting placebo and 3 chances out of 4 of getting the real deal. So getting the real deal, you have a lot of chances to get the real deal, right? How do you determine if the drug is working or not? Well, we'll do brain MRI at the beginning and at the end of the study, and then every patient will have a neurological exam, a very detailed neurological exam with scales, and that's why patients have to come back every 3 months to the clinic. Do I have to pay? No. Are patients reimbursed for terminal time? Yes, patients are reimbursed for the terminal time. What are the main inclusion criteria? Well, you need to have MSA diagnosed within 4 years, right? So someone has to have told you have MSA no earlier than it's 2016, okay? No, 2015, I'm sorry, 2015. Right? Patients need to be able to walk, even with help, that's fine. Even with 2 people, that's fine. If you can walk, if you can take 5 or 6 steps with help, that's fine. And patients is less than 80 years old. What are the main exclusion criteria? Chronic infections, because this drug can potentially increase the risk of infections, right? So if you have any chronic infection like HIV, tuberculosis, you might not be a good fit. If you have extremely high cholesterol or a major disease, you might not be a good fit. And if you have a pacemaker that it's preventing us from doing brain MRIs, you might not be a good fit. Nevertheless, the same as before. If you have questions, feel free to call or email Mr. Martinez or talk to me right now, right? And that's all. Just a summary, clinical trials, we need them to prove if a drug is effective or not, because FDA requires so, and insurance companies require FDA approval to pay for the drug. Getting involved in clinical trials, we encourage everyone to get in clinical trials involved, but it's not for everyone, right? It has pros and cons, and that's okay. I mean, no one is obliging you to be in a clinical trial. And just FYI, there's these clinical trials are right now open at NYU, and if you're interested, I'll be happy to talk to you right now. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. Perfect.